How frontier farmers made bad land produce food. When settlers moved west across North America during the 19th century, they often arrived with an extremely optimistic idea: find land, build a house, plant crops, and live from the farm. But the reality was much harder. The land might look rich from a wagon. There could be miles of grass, deep soil, rivers in the distance, and almost no other farms in sight. Yet turning that landscape into a reliable source of food could take years. The soil might be difficult to break. Rain might arrive at the wrong time. Grasshoppers could destroy a field. Winter could kill livestock. And one bad harvest could leave a family without enough food or seed for the following spring. So frontier farming was not simply about planting crops, it was about learning how to manipulate the land with very limited tools. Farmers developed methods for conserving water, restoring soil, controlling weeds, protecting crops, feeding animals, and saving enough food to survive between harvests. And many of those methods were surprisingly sophisticated. The first challenge: turning wild ground into a field. Before anything could be planted, the land had to be prepared. And that depended entirely on where the farmer lived. In forested areas, farming often began with an axe. Trees had to be removed before sunlight could reach the ground. Smaller trees were cut down. Larger trees sometimes took days of work. Stumps were even worse. A tree might be gone in a few hours, but its roots could remain firmly locked into the earth for years. Some settlers dug around stumps and cut the roots. Others used teams of animals to pull them out, but many simply farmed around them. A newly cleared frontier field could look very strange. Rows of corn might grow between blackened tree stumps. Gradually, those stumps rotted or were removed as the farmer gained more time and equipment. On the prairie, the problem was completely different. There were almost no trees to remove. Instead, farmers encountered sod. Prairie grass had enormous root systems woven through the surface of the soil. The result was a dense mat that could resist ordinary plows. Breaking this ground was so difficult that prairie settlers sometimes hired specialist teams just to plow new land. A strong team of oxen or horses pulled the plow while the farmer tried to keep the blade moving through the roots. Behind him, a long ribbon of sod rolled over. Foot by foot, open prairie became farmland. The first plowing was the hardest. Once the roots began decomposing, later cultivation became much easier. Why steel plows mattered. Early plows could struggle badly in prairie soil. Heavy earth stuck to the blade. The farmer had to stop repeatedly and scrape it clean. That wasted enormous amounts of time. Improved steel plows changed this. Their smoother surfaces allowed soil to slide away more easily. The stronger blades also cut through dense root systems. For a frontier farmer, this was not a minor convenience. It could mean cultivating several times more land with the same number of animals. And because nearly every major farm operation depended on animal power, saving time mattered enormously. Horses and oxen could work only so many hours before they needed food, water, and rest. A better plow effectively increased the productive power of the entire farm. Farmers learned to work with moisture. Water was one of the greatest uncertainties. In humid regions, farmers worried about too much rain. Farther west, they worried about not having enough. A crop might germinate beautifully in spring and then die during several weeks without rainfall. Farmers therefore learned to manage moisture in the soil. One simple method was repeated cultivation. At first, this sounds strange. Why disturb the soil when you want to keep water inside it? But farmers discovered that loosening the surface could create a dry layer of soil that reduced evaporation from below. This became part of what was later called dry farming. The farmer wanted rainwater to penetrate deeply. Then he wanted to stop as much of that moisture as possible from returning to the surface and disappearing into the air. Fields might be cultivated shortly after rain. Weeds were also removed aggressively because every weed was competing with the crop for moisture. Farmers in dry regions sometimes planted crops farther apart. That meant fewer plants per acre, but each individual plant had access to more water stored in the soil around it. A smaller crop that survived was better than a dense field that failed completely. Snow was valuable water. Winter snow was not always seen as an inconvenience. In dry country, it represented stored moisture. Farmers noticed where snow drifted and where it disappeared quickly. Fences, ridges, vegetation, and terrain could cause snow to accumulate in certain places. When it melted, that moisture entered the ground. Experienced farmers paid attention to these patterns. A field that captured winter moisture could sometimes produce better crops the following summer. Even the direction of plowing or the placement of windbreaks could influence how snow accumulated. This was farming based not on scientific instruments, but on observation repeated over many seasons. Irrigation changed entire regions. Where rivers or streams were available, irrigation offered another solution. Farmers dug channels to divert water toward fields. These systems could be surprisingly extensive. The basic principle was gravity. Water entered a ditch at a higher elevation and slowly moved downhill. Smaller channels carried it into individual fields. Sometimes simple gates controlled which field received water. This allowed crops to grow in regions where rainfall alone would never have supported reliable farming. But irrigation created another problem. Who controlled the water? A farmer upstream could divert too much. A damaged ditch could interrupt water for everyone below. Communities therefore developed rules concerning maintenance and access. Neighbors might cooperate to dig and repair irrigation channels. Water became almost as valuable as the land itself. Farmers rarely trusted just one crop. One of the most dangerous things a frontier family could do was depend entirely on a single crop. Wheat might bring good prices, but wheat could fail. Corn might tolerate certain conditions better. Potatoes could produce food from a relatively small patch. Beans could be dried and stored. Squash and pumpkins kept well through part of the winter. A diversified farm was safer. The main field might contain corn or wheat. Nearby, there might be oats for animals. A kitchen garden could contain onions, beans, cabbage, carrots, turnips, peas, herbs, and other vegetables. Fruit trees might be planted as a long-term investment. The orchard would not feed the family immediately. Young trees could take years to produce substantial fruit. But once established, they became an important source of apples, peaches, or other crops, depending on the region. A successful frontier farm was therefore not simply a field, it was an entire food system. Corn was almost perfect frontier. Food corn became especially important because nearly every part of it was useful. People ate the grain. It could be ground into cornmeal, it could be boiled, it could be dried, animals could eat it, the stalks could sometimes be used as fodder. The crop also produced large amounts of food from a relatively modest area. Most importantly, dried corn stored well. This was essential. A frontier farmer was not trying merely to produce food during summer. He needed food that would remain edible through winter and sometimes well into the next growing season. Storage life mattered almost as much as yield. Wheat required more work. Wheat could be extremely valuable, but growing it involved a long chain of labor. First, the ground had to be prepared, then seed had to be planted. When the wheat matured, it had to be cut quickly. Wait too long and storms could flatten it. Harvest too early and the grain might not be ready. Before mechanical harvesters became widespread, workers used sickles and scythes. The grain was cut and gathered into bundles. Those bundles were tied together and stood upright in shocks. This allowed the crop to continue drying. Then came threshing. The grain had to be separated from the stalk. For small farms, this could involve beating the crop with flails. On larger farms, threshing machines eventually transformed the process. They were expensive, so one machine might serve many farms. Threshing season became a community event. Crews traveled from one property to another. Everyone worked quickly because the harvest represented months of effort sitting exposed to weather. Seed had to be saved. Modern farmers can order seed whenever they need it. Frontier families did not always have that luxury. A portion of the harvest had to be protected specifically for planting the next year. That required discipline. Imagine a family approaching the end of a difficult winter. Food supplies are running low. Bags of grain remain in storage. But some of that grain cannot be eaten. It is seed. Eating it might solve today's hunger while destroying next year's crop. Farm families therefore selected and stored seed carefully. Good ears of corn could be chosen because they showed desirable characteristics. Seeds from successful plants were valuable because they had already proven capable of surviving local conditions. Over many seasons, this helped farmers develop crop varieties better suited to particular regions. Crop rotation protected the soil. Farmers learned that repeated planting could reduce productivity. A field that produced excellent wheat for several seasons might begin giving smaller harvests. One solution was rotation. Instead of planting the same crop continuously, farmers alternated crops. Grain might be followed by corn. Some fields could be used for pasture. Legumes such as peas, beans, or clover could be included. Farmers did not understand nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the modern scientific sense, but they could observe results. Certain crops seemed to improve the land. Others seemed to exhaust it. Animals grazing pasture also returned manure directly to the soil. Rotation, therefore, became one way to balance the farm's demands on the land. Manure was too valuable to waste. Every horse, cow, pig, and chicken produced something useful, manure. For a frontier farm without manufactured fertilizer, animal waste represented nutrients that could be returned to the soil. Barn floors were often covered with straw or other bedding. This absorbed urine and mixed with manure. The resulting material could be collected and spread on fields. Kitchen scraps and plant waste could also decompose. Ash from wood fires sometimes found uses around farms and gardens as well. The principle was simple. Anything useful should return to the system. A wasteful farm was less likely to survive. Livestock were part of the farming machinery. Today, we separate machinery from animals. On the frontier, animals often were the machinery. Horses and oxen pulled plows. They hauled wagons. They dragged logs. They powered various pieces of equipment. Without them, the amount of land one family could cultivate fell dramatically. This meant feeding work animals was not optional. Farmers had to grow crops for their own animals in addition to feeding themselves. Oats could feed horses. Corn could feed pigs and cattle. Hay had to be stored for winter. A farmer who failed to produce enough winter feed might lose the very animals needed to plant next year's crop. Haymaking was a race against weather. Hay sounds simple. Cut grass, dry it, store it. But the weather determined everything. Cut grass contains significant moisture. If stacked immediately, it could rot. It could even heat internally enough to become dangerous. So hay had to dry. Farmers cut it during periods of good weather and spread or turned it so air could circulate. Once sufficiently dry, it was gathered. Before modern balers, hay was usually stored loose. Large outdoor haystacks required careful construction to shed rain. Barn lofts also held enormous quantities. During winter, the farmer gradually fed this stored summer grass to livestock. In northern regions, hay was essentially preserved sunlight. Grass grew using summer sun. Animals consumed that stored energy months later when the ground was frozen. Weeds were controlled, constantly. A weed did more than make a field look untidy. It consumed water, it consumed nutrients, and it competed for sunlight. Farmers therefore cultivated fields repeatedly. Horse-drawn cultivators were especially useful in row crops such as corn. Their blades disturbed the soil between plants. Workers still had to use hoes where machines could not reach. This was one reason fields were planted in organized rows. Rows were not simply visually neat. They allowed animals and equipment to pass between crops. The geometry of the field reduced labor. Insects could destroy everything. Frontier farmers had relatively few effective tools against major insect outbreaks. One of the most terrifying examples was the grasshopper. A large swarm could descend on a farm and consume crops with astonishing speed. Farmers tried many methods. They burned areas. They dug trenches. They used mechanical devices designed to collect or destroy insects. But during severe outbreaks, very little could stop them. This reality shaped frontier agriculture. Families understood that no matter how well they farmed, nature could still overwhelm them. That uncertainty encouraged diversification and food storage. The more reserves a household had, the better its chance of surviving disaster. Fences became essential. A beautiful field of corn could disappear quickly if livestock wandered into it. Fencing was therefore part of crop protection. In wooded areas, timber was readily available. Farmers built split-rail fences from logs, but on open prairie, wood might have to be transported long distances. That made conventional fences expensive. Some farmers planted living hedges. Others used stone where available. The spread of barbed wire solved many of these problems. A relatively small amount of metal could enclose large areas. Fence posts were still required, but far less timber was needed than for a solid wooden fence. Barbed wire changed both farming and ranching. Fields could be protected. Animals could be controlled. Property boundaries became more permanent. The open landscape gradually became divided into individual farms and ranches. Preserving the harvest was almost another farming season. Producing food was not enough. Food spoiled, so a huge amount of labor went into preservation. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and other root crops could be stored in cool cellars. Apples kept under the right conditions. Other fruits were sliced and dried. Beans were dried. Corn was dried. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables could be pickled. Milk could become butter or cheese. Excess fat could be rendered. Nothing that could safely be stored was casually thrown away. The farm kitchen was effectively a food processing center, and during harvest season, preservation work could continue from morning until night. Root cellars were simple but effective. A cellar used the temperature of the earth itself. Underground conditions were generally cooler in summer and more stable during winter. This created a useful environment for storing certain foods. The cellar might be built beneath the house or separately into a hillside. Ventilation mattered. Too much moisture encouraged rot. Too little could cause some produce to shrivel. Families learned how different foods behaved. Potatoes required darkness. Apples needed careful handling because bruised fruit spoiled faster. One rotten item could encourage nearby food to spoil. Stored crops therefore had to be checked periodically. Preservation was not simply putting food away and forgetting about it. Farms produced their own replacement supplies. Isolation forced frontier households to be resourceful. A broken wooden handle might be replaced from local timber. Leather harness equipment could be repaired. Fence posts were cut. Nails were reused. Metal parts might be taken to a local blacksmith instead of discarded. Seed was saved. Animals reproduced. Clothing was repaired repeatedly. The closer a farm came to producing its own necessities, the more resilient it became. Cash was scarce in many rural communities. A farmer might own land and animals while having very little actual money. Self-sufficiency reduced the number of things that had to be purchased. Neighbors functioned like extra machinery. There were limits to what one family could accomplish. Harvest was one example. A crop might be ready at exactly the same moment bad weather was approaching. Suddenly, the farm needed 20 workers instead of 4. Neighbors filled that gap. Families helped each other during harvest. They raised barns together. They exchanged animals and equipment. Threshing machines moved between farms. This created a system where labor itself became a shared resource. One household might provide several workers to a neighbor this week, knowing the favor would be returned later. Community cooperation allowed farms to perform tasks that would otherwise have required expensive machinery or hired labor. The most important skill was observation. Perhaps the most important frontier. Farming technique was not a particular tool. It was learning the land. A farmer who stayed in one place for years gradually built a mental map. He knew where water collected after storms. He knew which field warmed first in spring. He knew which areas suffered frost. He knew which slope dried quickly. He knew where animals preferred to graze. He knew which seeds produced well and which failed. Those details rarely appeared in manuals. They were learned through seasons of observation, and sometimes through expensive mistakes. The frontier rewarded adaptability. Settlers who stubbornly tried to reproduce farming methods from another region could fail. Those who changed their techniques to match local conditions had a better chance. Conclusion: frontier agriculture was built from simple technologies used with extraordinary care. Farmers turned prairie into fields with animal-powered plows. They conserved rainfall through cultivation. They diverted rivers through irrigation ditches. They rotated crops. They fertilized fields with manure. They saved seed. They planted several kinds of food instead of depending on one harvest. They preserved vegetables underground, dried grain, salted meat, stored hay, and protected fields with fences. None of these techniques alone guaranteed survival. That was the reality of frontier farming. A farmer could make every correct decision and still lose a crop to drought, frost, hail, insects, fire, or disease. But every small improvement increased the odds. A deeper furrow, a better fence, a fuller hayloft, a healthier workhorse, a carefully protected bag of seed, a few extra jars or sacks stored before winter. Frontier farming was therefore less about one revolutionary invention and more about hundreds of practical decisions made every day. Those decisions transformed wilderness into farms, and eventually those scattered farms became some of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. But before the machines, grain elevators, railroads, and industrial farms came something much simpler: a family, a piece of difficult land, a few animals, a handful of tools, and the knowledge that if they could not make that land produce food, there might be no one coming to rescue them.